The Appalachian Trail is an incredibly popular 2,200-mile long public hiking trail in the eastern United States that traverses scenic woodland, pastoral, wild and culturally resonant lands. Since 1921, it claims to be the longest hiking trail in the world, and more than 3 million people hike segments of the trail each year. The Appalachian Trail has always been deemed as generally safe, with most dangers related to weather conditions, human error, plants, animals and diseases. One other danger on the Appalachian Trail Conservancy list is hostile humans. Since its completion in 1937, there have been 13 known murders on the trail, with the first murder reported in 1974. Today we're going to talk about the case number 1, the murder of Joel Polson and Margaret Harriet. Before we get into today's story, World's End posts regularly to tell you some incredible, tragic tales of travelling around the world. If you want to see more, please like and subscribe so you don't miss out. Episode 1 starts with the murder of Joel Polson, which was the first ever recorded murder on the Appalachian Trail. Joel Polson was a young 26-year-old man who dreamed of hiking the Appalachian Trail. He had only recently met 25-year-old Margaret Harriet at their restaurant job waiting tables. He talked non-stop about the great adventure he had in the works. He planned to hike the entire Appalachian Trail and tried to get Margaret to join him on the trip. Margaret laughed off the idea, as she just met him and eventually agreed to join him on the trip of a lifetime. Knowing her parents would never let her hike alone with a man, Margaret told them that she'd be one of 15 college students that Joel would lead on the trip. She introduced him to her parents in mid-April in 1974. Finally, they started backpacking the Appalachian Trail, but soon figured out they were way overpacked and that the backpacks were severely overloaded. They were using external frame backpacks, which paired with being overpacked and overweight, resulted in Margaret getting a huge blister on her foot. They only managed to hike 6 miles that day before deciding to rest in the Low Gap Shelter. The Low Gap Shelter was a cabin built by the Conservancy for the hikers to rest safely. Unfortunately, this is where they run into Ralph Howard Fox, who introduced himself as Ralph. He seemed harmless, though certainly down on his luck, and it looked like he hadn't showered in a good while. In the shelter beside him was a small pile of his belongings, including a blanket, leather jacket and canvas rucksack. Ralph didn't look like a hiker. He was wearing suede desert boots and didn't have any proper hiking gear. That evening, Joel and Margaret were washing up at a nearby stream, and Joel confessed that he didn't trust Ralph. Even though they had their doubts, they cooked dinner and offered some to Ralph, which he declined. Instead, Ralph just kept heading into the woods and returning with more firewood over and over again. They both felt nervous that something wasn't right, and Margaret and Joel decided they should leave first thing in the morning. Thankfully, the night passed uneventfully, but that morning, Joel urged Margaret that they should start moving. Joel decided to freshen up in the nearby stream as Margaret packed her things. Sadly, this is the last time Margaret would ever see Joel alive. As Margaret was lacing up her boots, she heard a sharp, loud blast. Ralph was walking towards her where the stream was located with what looked like a revolver in his hand. Ralph tied her hands behind her back with twine, ordered her to her feet and led her into the woods. In these woods, he tied her feet together, blindfolded her, and left her there for 15 minutes. When he returned, he led her back to the cabin, removed her blindfold, and told her I got rid of him. He ordered her to eat and drink as he went through Joel's belongings, looking for money. When Margaret said to him, terrified, he only has traveller's checks. Ralph's behaviour becomes even more unpredictable when he leads her to the woods and ties her to a tree. He tells her that he's going to leave a note in the cabin so people know where she is and she can be rescued in some sort of compassionate act. However, he then changes his mind and says he's worried that she won't be found and she'll die in the woods if no one finds the note. He gave Margaret 2 options. He told her she could either stay where she was or hike out the mountains together and reach a highway for help. She went for the second option. They headed back to the Appalachian Trail with Margaret leading. Her hands were now untied and Ralph was following behind with his gun. Ralph told her that if they ran into anyone and Margaret said anything or did anything to signal that there's something wrong, he'd kill everyone. As they were walking, Margaret noticed 2 loggers holding chainsaws, who she bumped into the day before. She was terrified that they'd noticed that she was hiking with a different man and put them in danger, so she kept her head down and tried to pass unnoticed. Not knowing this, Ralph asked where the next crossing was, which they said was a long hike away. Luckily for the men, they didn't notice Margaret. As they were hiking, Ralph confessed to Margaret that he'd actually recently broken out of jail and fell out of his element on the trail. He said he wanted to head back to the west, and the quickest way of doing this was to use the light hiking gear which he stole from Joel. Finally, they reached the crossing, which was the nearest road. Margaret must have been incredibly relieved to find a road and hopefully find help, but Ralph said he wouldn't let go just yet. He said they had to find a hotel room first, rest, and he'd let her go first thing in the morning. Whilst walking down the road, a young woman pulled over and asked if they needed a ride. They agreed. Ralph told the woman that they lost their IDs, but that they had traveller's checks, and if she knew anywhere that she could possibly cash these in. They were taken to the Chattahoochee Hotel. When they checked in, Ralph signed the names as Mr. and Mrs. Joel Polson. Interestingly, when they got to the room, he told Margaret that she could have a memento of Joel by keeping anything she wanted from Joel's backpack. Interestingly, Ralph seems to repeat this behaviour of trying to be seen as a nice guy whilst ignoring the obvious contradiction of being a murderer as well as a kidnapper. Whilst in the hotel room, Ralph grew increasingly paranoid. He followed her into the bathroom and made sure she didn't climb out of the bathroom window and sat in the chair with his gun while she slept. The next day, after cashing more traveller's checks, Ralph changed his plans again, saying they'd find a bus station in Cleveland and then they'd go their separate ways from there. After a lot of hitchhiking, they settled on getting their separate buses from Cornelia. Ralph's bus was due in first, but that was running late. Eventually Ralph's bus arrived and Margaret watched the bus pull away. Then after a tense wait, her own bus arrived a short time later. Margaret was free and safe. When she arrived at Columbia, she tried to call her older brother, who lived nearby but got no answer, and also failed to get a response from the parents. She then called the Columbia police, where she told her incredible and tragic story. On May 11th, GBI Special Agent Stanley L. Thompson and a local sheriff went to investigate the cabin. There they found Joel Polson covered with forest debris across the stream from the shelter. His head was in a plastic bag, and the bag had been tied around the head with a piece of string. The autopsy found that a .38 caliber bullet had entered Joel's skull just behind his left ear. Agent Thompson and Sheriff Baker drove to Atlanta, where the police obtained a search warrant. When they arrived, he wasn't home, but inside they found Joel's backpack, his clothes, camping gear, and a revolver containing 4 live rounds and 1 empty cartridge. Thompson waited inside for Ralph to return, but he was quickly arrested. So who was Ralph Howard Fox? Ralph was a 31-year-old man from Detroit. He'd been involved in several crimes when he was younger, including kidnapping a girl from a party he threw while his parents were away. At 17, he was arrested for car theft, and at 18, he was arrested again for breaking and entering. In 1963, he went to New Mexico with a 15-year-old girl named Anne, and he was arrested for statutory rape and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He married Anne a few months later. In March 1964, with Anne pregnant, Ralph forced a Detroit high school junior into his car at gunpoint and drove her 13 miles to a wooded lover's lane in Troy, Michigan. Fortunately, a vigilant police officer happened to come upon them as he was tying the girl's hands behind her back. He was given a 15-year sentence for the crime, but he only served a small part before he escaped from the Michigan State Prison in Jackson. At this point, Anne divorced Ralph. In October 1969, he was recaptured in Miami and returned to the Michigan State Prison. While out on parole, he broke into Anne's apartment and lay in wait for her. When she walked in, he opened fire with a rifle but fortunately missed. Then he headed to New Orleans, then Fort Lauderdale, and after that Atlanta. He started on the Appalachian Trail for the first time 5 days before killing Joel in May 1974. Bravely, Margaret picked out Ralph from a police lineup. The brave actions from Margaret and the forensic evidence from the bullet convicted Ralph of murder in 1975 and sentenced to life in prison in Georgia State Prison. In July 2003, he died in State Prison Hospital of lung cancer. So that is the incredibly sad story of the murder of Joel Polson and the kidnapping of Margaret Harriet. Joel Polson seemed like such an incredibly kind and motivated young man who followed his dream to hike such a beautiful trail. Unfortunately, by pure chance, he crossed paths with a monster. I was only going to do one video on the Appalachian Trail murders, but from the very first case I decided the stories needed telling in their entirety. This is why I decided to make a series on this. Please feel free to subscribe. I'll put all of these videos in a playlist for you to watch in a series and you can binge to your heart's content. If you like this video, please leave a like and a comment. It's completely free and it helps more than you think. Lastly, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.